Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating work. It's Frederick Copleston's A History of Philosophy, Volume 6, Modern Philosophy, From the French Enlightenment to Kant. It's a pretty dense book, but honestly it's full of those aha moments that make you rethink how you see the world.
It really is. And, it's so easy to oversimplify these periods. Like, people think of the French Enlightenment and they just picture Voltaire, taking on the church. But there's so much more to it than that.
Right. It wasn't just about tearing things down.
Exactly.
It was also about trying to build something new.
Yeah, think about figures like D'Alembert, Diderot, Turgot. They were really into scientific progress and social reform. They were all about using knowledge to make a better future.
Like they were saying, okay, enough with the old ways. Let's use reason and observation to figure out how society actually works.
Exactly.
And that's where Montesquieu comes in, right? Yeah. His spirit of the laws was mind-blowing to me. He argued that laws aren't arbitrary. They're shaped by all sorts of factors like climate and history, like it's part of a society's DNA.
That's a great way to put it. And what's really interesting is that Montesquieu was already talking about these operative ideals, these underlying forces that shape how societies develop. He was kind of foreshadowing the whole field of sociology.
Wow, so he was way ahead of his time.
He really was.
And then, of course, there's his idea of the separation of powers, which is basically the foundation of modern democracy.
Right.
It's incredible how these Enlightenment thinkers are still influencing our lives today.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, are current systems really the best? Or are they just what we've inherited from these guys?
That's a good question. Now, Copleston does point out that not all Enlightenment thinkers were on the same page. He contrasts Montesquieu with Rousseau, for example. Rousseau's social contract and his ideas about the general will were super influential, but also incredibly controversial. Yeah, Rousseau's a tough one. He's all about individual liberty on the one hand, but then he also says that the needs of the state can sometimes override those liberties. It's kind of like make up your mind, Rousseau.
Right. There's this tension in his work between individual freedom and the demands of the state, and it's a tension that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. Think about all the debates we have about privacy versus security, or individual rights versus public health measures.
Exactly. It's like Rousseau planted a seed that keeps growing all these new and sometimes thorny branches.
It's a good reminder that these aren't just abstract ideas. They have real-world consequences that we're still dealing with centuries later. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the German Enlightenment. It had a very different flavor than its French counterpart.
Yeah, for sure. While the French were all about observation and experience, the Germans were more into a rationalistic approach. Copleston focuses on Christian Wolff, who really tried to revive a systematic and logical way of thinking about philosophy.
So it's like a pendulum swing back from empiricism to pure reason.
You could say that.
And speaking of systems, that leads us to Kant, right? Because Copleston makes this connection between Wolff and Kant. He shows how Wolff's work actually influenced Kant's early thinking.
Yeah, Kant is like the ultimate system builder in philosophy. He takes all these different ideas and he constructs this incredibly intricate and powerful system of thought. And at the heart of it all is his Copernican revolution. This idea that instead of our minds conforming to objects, objects actually conform to the structure of our mind.
Whoa, hold on. So it's not just about what's objectively out there in the world. It's about how our minds make sense of it.
Exactly.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It's like saying we're not just passive observers of the world. We're actively creating our experience of it through the structure of our minds.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
And Copleston does a great job of explaining how this leads to Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena.
Phenomena and noumena.
Right. Phenomena is the world as we experience it. And noumena is the world of things in themselves which we can never truly know.
So it's like we're all living in the Matrix. We experience this reality, but the code behind it, the ultimate truth, is always out of reach.
That's a great analogy. Kant wouldn't necessarily say that ultimate reality doesn't exist, but he would say that we can't directly access it with our minds. We're limited to understanding the rules of the game, so to speak, the way our minds structure our experience.
And that has huge implications for metaphysics, right? It's like Kant is saying we need to completely rethink the whole game, not just the players.
Absolutely. And this leads us directly into his groundbreaking work on ethics. Copleston highlights Kant's concept of the categorical imperative, this idea that we should act from a sense of duty, treating others as ends in themselves and not just means to an end.
So it's not about what benefits me personally. It's about what's universally right. which is a pretty challenging concept.
It is. It sets a very high bar for ethical behavior.
It's like Kant is saying you can't just do whatever you want. You have to think about the big picture, the universal implications of your actions.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that makes Kant's ethics so powerful. It forces us to consider our responsibilities to others, not just our own self-interest.
It's like level up your moral game, everyone Kant is watching.
He might be. And it's fascinating how he ties ethics back into this idea of reason. You know, he's saying that reason can't give us all the answers about ultimate reality, but it can help us create a more just and ethical world.
Right, it's like reason is a tool. It can be used for good or for evil. It's up to us to choose wisely. Now, before we get too lost in the Kantian rabbit hole, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the broader legacy of the Enlightenment. Copleston doesn't just focus on individual thinkers. He also looks at how these ideas shape the world, and I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And one of the things that struck me is that the Enlightenment didn't just disappear. It sparked revolutions in thought and action. And we're still feeling its effects today.
Oh, for sure. I mean, think about the idea of progress. That's an Enlightenment concept through and through.
Right. But it's also a concept that has its critics. Some people see progress as a double-edged sword or even a destructive force.
Yeah, that's a good point. On the one hand, we have this optimistic view of progress, this idea that things are always getting better, that we're moving towards a more enlightened future. But then there's the other side, the people who are more skeptical, who see the downsides of progress.
Exactly. And Copleston highlights this tension by contrasting thinkers like Condorcet, who is all about continuous progress, with Rousseau, who saw civilization itself as a source of corruption.
That's so interesting. It's like we're still wrestling with these same questions today. Is technology connecting us or isolating us? Is knowledge liberating or overwhelming?
Those are big questions.
Big questions, and they're directly related to the ideas that these Enlightenment thinkers were grappling with. How do we balance individual freedom with the common good? How do we use reason and knowledge to create a better world for everyone?
And it makes you wonder, what would these Enlightenment thinkers make of our world today?
Right. Would they be impressed with our advancements in science and technology? Or would they be horrified by our problems like climate change and social inequality?
It's hard to say. But I think they would definitely have something to say about it.
I think so too. And it's not just about politics and society either. These Enlightenment ideas also had a huge impact on philosophy itself. Copleston traces their influence on all sorts of later movements like idealism, empiricism, and pragmatism.
Right. It's like each generation of philosophers is responding to the ideas that came before, building on them or challenging them or sometimes both.
It's like a giant conversation that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's one of the things that makes studying philosophy so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about engaging in this ongoing dialogue, this grand debate about the meaning of life, the nature of knowledge, the best way to live.
I love that. A grand debate.
And I think that's what Copleston ultimately wants us to take away from his book. He's not trying to give us all the answers. He's inviting us to join the conversation, to think critically and creatively about these big questions.
So it's less about finding the right answer and more about asking the right questions.
Exactly.
And in order to do that, we need to understand the different perspectives, the historical context, the nuances of the arguments.
And that's where Copleston's A History of Philosophy really shines. He provides this incredibly rich and detailed account of the Enlightenment. But he does it in a way that's both accessible and engaging. You don't have to be a philosophy professor to appreciate his insights.
Right, he's like our guide through this complex and fascinating world of ideas, pointing out the landmarks, explaining the history, and encouraging us to explore further on our own.
He even throws in some witty commentary along the way to keep things interesting.
Oh yeah, he's got a great sense of humor.
Yeah. He does. I think that's one of the things I appreciate most about his writing. He doesn't take himself too seriously. He's clearly passionate about philosophy. But he also recognizes that it can be intimidating, even a little bit absurd at times.
So he's not afraid to poke a little fun at the philosophers he's writing about.
Or even at himself.
It makes the whole subject feel more human, more relatable.
Absolutely. He's not just lecturing us from on high. He's inviting us to join him in this intellectual adventure, to marvel at the brilliance and sometimes the sheer weirdness of these thinkers who shaped our world.
It's like, come along for the ride, folks. It's going to be bumpy but mind-expanding.
Exactly. I love that. And I think that's the best way to approach any intellectual pursuit, really. Be curious, be open-minded, and don't be afraid to ask questions, even if they seem silly or obvious.
Because sometimes the most profound insights come from the simplest questions.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes philosophy so exciting. It's a never-ending quest for knowledge and understanding.
And it's a quest that's open to everyone. You don't need a PhD to engage with these ideas, to find meaning and purpose in the world.
And that brings us back to Frederick Copleston's book. It's an excellent starting point for anyone who wants to dive deeper into the world of modern philosophy.
It really is, and it's a great starting point if you want to really dig into these ideas.
So if you're ready to embark on a little intellectual adventure, we highly recommend checking out Copleston's book. It's a dense read, but trust me, it's worth the effort.
It is. And to make it a little easier for you, we've actually included a link to purchase the book in the show notes. You can also find some more information about Frederick Copleston there, and about some of the Enlightenment thinkers that we've been talking about.
Oh yeah, definitely check that out. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to the channel? We've got more deep dives coming your way, lots of fascinating books and ideas to explore.
Always something new to learn.
Exactly. So, until next time, keep those minds curious.
And those moments mindful.